Hello, everyone. I'm Abe Gruswitz, he, him pronouns. I'm zooming in here from East Orange, New Jersey. I am part of the GEO Collective. I'm also a student at St. Mary's University in their Cooperative Management Master's Program. And I'm here to talk about democratic education for democratic workplaces. So today I will be talking about some of the history behind democratic education, particularly democratic schools, and some of the elements of the model. And hopefully we'll have a good conversation at the end about applying these models to our own cooperatives or federations. I got involved with solidarity economy work through democratic education. Back in 2000, I was part of a Sudbury school in Connecticut called the Greenwood Sudbury School. And it was there that I was talking to my director at the school about how I love this democratic workplace that we have in the school. But like, it would be cool if there were other examples of democratic workplaces out there. And then she told me that I should talk to her friend, Len Krimmerman from the GEO Collective. And that's how I got involved with cooperatives. The first time I walked into a democratic school, I was taken back a bit by the experience of a school run by students democratically and staff as well. When I walked in for the first time, I was greeted by a 5-year-old boy who asked me my name, introduced himself, and said, "Oh, are you here for the tour?" I expected him to then bring me to some adult that would give me the tour, but he gave me the tour himself. We went through each room of the school building, went into the computer room, went into the dark room. They had a old photography there, and the art room, the playground. He told me about the whole layout of the school, about how the school meetings are run, about their conflict resolution process that they call the judicial committee. And yeah, all the ins and outs of it. And then he brought me to the school director, and she asked me, "Oh, how'd you like your tour? Do you have any questions for me?" And I said, "No, he really answered all of them. But I have a question about him," because I was just really impressed by this very, very articulate 5-year-old who was very confident in himself and knew the ins and outs of how the whole school was run. And she said, "Yeah, he is very active in the school meeting. And because he wanted to get his ideas across in the school meeting, he started speaking up and started to learn how things were done so that he could have a voice himself. And he's articulate in that way because he is doing real life decision making." So I got very involved with that school for a number of years. And later on, I co-founded a democratic free school with some other people in Maplewood, New Jersey, called the South Mountain Co-op, which I was involved with for 2 years. In between those times, that is a span from I went from 2000 to 2005 with the first school, did a whole bunch of unschooling cooperatives in between, and then was part of the South Mountain Co-op in 2013 to 2015. So education is pretty central to cooperative development. So I get very interested in how democratic education principles and processes can be applied to the education for democratic workplaces. I also am very involved with intentional communities and very interested in how we can have learning integrated with the larger community around it, not just this is where the children are, this is where the adults are. I have found in my experience that children learn very much by osmosis about the world around them. So having adults model democracy has a big effect on children learning it as well. I'm going to go through some slides here to go through some history of things. Let's see, screen share. How do I do the, I'm sorry. Oh, here we go, regional rendezvous day 1. Is that what I select? Okay. Just let me know if you can all see this. Does this work out?
Yep, we can see the view that you have, not the like presenter view. So we see like the slides on the side, but we can see in big what you're looking at.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, how do I do this? How do I start the slideshow here?
Probably under view.
Okay, thank you. All right, cool. All right. So who here recognizes these handsome Spaniards here? I can't see the chat, so if anyone wants to speak up. People.
Yeah. Don Jose Arizmendi Arrieta on the right.
Yep. Anyone recognize this guy on the left? Well, he influenced Arizmendi quite a bit in his educational style, but preceded him a bit. He's from Barcelona area. That's Francisco Ferrer. And in 1901, Ferrer founded the Barcelona Modern School, which provided a secular libertarian curriculum instead of the religious compulsory lessons that were common in Spanish schools. He felt that children should be given liberty at the expense of conformity, regulation, and discipline. His school eschewed punishments, rewards, and exams, and encouraged practical experience over academic study. The school hosted lectures for adults, a school for teaching training, and a radical printing press which printed textbooks and the school's journal. Now, he had started around 120 offshoots of school, and so spread throughout Spain. And in mid-1909, Ferrer was arrested and accused of orchestrating a week of insurrection known as Barcelona's Tragic Week. Now, a lot of his supporters said he had nothing to do with it. He definitely didn't orchestrate it, but he may have had something to do with it. But the Spanish government was not happy with him to begin with for starting these schools. And he was executed. His execution triggered international outcry. And from his execution came hundreds of schools around the world inspired by his modern school that throughout the United States, throughout Europe, Brazil, Asia. And here is the Ferrer Modern School. On the left, oh, I didn't delete those numbers. On the left is one of their first locations in New York City. On the right is their commune in New Jersey, which was outside of New Brunswick, New Jersey. It was an anarchist commune and free school. And it had organizers like Emma Goldman, had many visitors like anarchist Helen Keller. And it lasted a good while. It lasted from the early 1900s all the way into the Second Red Scare. It also, around that time, had a lot of conflict because the anarchist organizers were joined by communist organizers who tried to take over the model. Another school inspired by the modern schools was the Summerhill School in the UK, founded in 1921 by A.S. Neal. The Summerhill School is a boarding school that is democratically run by students and staff together. And it's one of the longest lasting democratic schools. I have another one that's a little, I believe might be a little bit longer, a bit longer than that later in the slideshow, but this is definitely one of the longest. And it's still there, still running. A.S. Neal's daughter Zoe Reed had taken over after him. I'm not sure who is the director at this point. But inspired by the Summerhill School, we had in the US the Sudbury Valley School in Massachusetts, which is a school that is democratically run by students and staff. They have a specific culture. I'm going to talk about two branches in the US of democratic schools. This is one of them, because the Sudbury Valley School had many other Sudbury schools start inspired by them throughout the United States. One thing that I would say is specific to the Sudbury Valley model is that staff are encouraged to not propose any activities for the kids. The culture there is that the kids come up with the ideas of what the activities and classes are. It is less likely that there would be a classroom format where there's a teacher in front and a bunch of kids at desks. At the Sudbury School that I taught at in Connecticut, if you were to walk into this school, you'd probably see one staff member with a student learning Spanish together while another one's on the computers looking up something about World War II. Some kids might be playing on the playground or making forts in the woods. Some might be having casual conversations or philosophical conversations. And other kids might be in the art room doing art. But the studies are emergent. It follows the passion of the student. So one thing that is really nice as a teacher is anyone that you are teaching is there because they want to be. You're following their passion. A lot of it is about self-discovery. There's no specific curriculum. It's a learner-led curriculum. But if there's any curriculum, it's democracy and it's conflict resolution and it's how to communicate with each other. Another branch of democratic schools in the US are the free schools. The free school in Albany was one of the first ones to have that name, but not the first to use that title of the free school. And they were founded by Mary Loya in the bottom right there. Mary Loya is one of my favorite human beings. She's been a mentor to a lot of different people, including myself. She's now, I believe, 101. But she started this school in 1969 in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And when she did it, she invested in the future quite a bit by buying up the whole neighborhood and fixing it up with the neighborhood. So the neighborhood came together, fixed up these buildings, and the rent from housing, which is low rent, goes to the free school, which offsets a lot of the tuition prices. So tuition at the free school can be from $0 a month to $100 a month. It's ridiculously cheap. And one thing that would be different about the free school versus the Sudbury School is that they do have classes, and they have the class format. They just are elective, all elective. So as students can decide to be part of a class or not be part of a class. And there's a lot of democratic schools that came out of the free school tradition from there. I would say that another cultural difference between the two is the Sudbury schools modeled themselves after the New England town hall meeting. And the free school has more of a radical tradition. Mary Loya was an anarchist, worked a lot with the Mohawk tribe in the area as well, and indigenous sovereignty issues. So there is a kind of cultural difference, even though the educational models are very similar. This is going back in time a bit, but folk schools in Scandinavian countries, starting in Denmark in the 1840s, were started as not grade schools or high schools, but a kind of gap year kind of school, like a school for adults to learn political education and traditional skills like woodworking and such, and fiber arts. But they were started with the spirit of democratizing peasants and conjoining physical work with liberal values. They most followed communalist principles of living, cooking, and cleaning together. And that was all done along with the cultural education and political education. At the same time, Tolstoy started his democratic school, the Yasnaya Polyana Education Center, which is still in existence today. And this was also a school that was more self-directed learning, that did not have the disciplinary measures of punishment that a lot of the compulsory schools did at the time. One folk school here, the International People's College in Denmark, had a lot of movement people move through it. The alumni included anti-fascist rebels in the Spanish Civil War, members of the Danish resistance in the Second World War, anti-racist activists in the first bus of the Freedom Riders in the US, and anti-colonial activists like Jomo Kenyatta, who went on to be the first president of Kenya. Many African Americans visited Denmark and borrowed from the Danish social programs like the folk schools and cooperative movement to uplift the lives of African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. These schools in Denmark had many African Americans as part of them, and also many visitors from the US. The Highlander Folk School comes from this tradition and was started by Miles Horton and Don West, and carried on that tradition of political education. And same trajectory, the freedom schools came out of that tradition of folk schools, and were heavily focused on the movement organizing and political education. Now this fellow, I'm sure a lot of you know, came about a little later than that, and Paulo Freire didn't speak on direct democracy of students, but he wrote about the relationship of the teacher to the student and the dialogical relationship in the classroom. So he spoke against the banking model of education, And his model was that, and he was fighting against the idea that the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the student knows nothing. Teacher thinks and the student is thought about. The teacher speaks and students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and forces his choice and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the act of the teacher. Teacher chooses the program content and the students who are not consulted adapt to it. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional knowledge, which he or she sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. The teacher is the subject of the learning process while the pupils are mere objects. In popular education, a lot of the process starts with setting themes with the students and working from the experiences of the participants, identifying the pattern, the patterns and the themes of knowledge and what people want to learn. And linking to the patterns, new information to what people know, and practicing skill strategizing and planning for action, and apply what's been learned in the world, and always along this process, challenging unequal power relationships in the learning process. I highly recommend Bell Hooks' ideas on popular education. If you've read Proliferate, Bell Hooks brings a lot more, I believe, to the topic. Now, the schools I've been part of had students that were ages 5 to 18, some 4-year-olds, but I just want to give this example here. Play Mountain Place in California is a democratic preschool. So you have students under the age of 5 making democratic decisions together and running the program. This Butterflies program in India is what they call an open school, but same idea as a free school. And it is part child labor union, not a labor union in the sense that we have here, but they work with children living on the street to help them have more ideal situations than child labor and living on the street. I don't know if I go back. Well,
Abe, I think your sound is cutting out. We can't hear you. And you look frozen. Abe, there's a suggestion in the chat to cut your video to save bandwidth for audio. That might be a good idea.
Yeah, what's that?
There's an idea to cut your video just to save bandwidth for your audio because we can't hear you. and your video is frozen.
Oh, okay, sure thing. All right, no problem. Can you stop the sharing for me? It's not starting.
Oh, you want to
Stopping
stop sharing?
Stop the sharing so I can. Yes, computer.
I don't think I can stop your screen share. There we go. That worked. Whatever you just did. But if you're talking, we can't hear you. Abe, do you want to try logging out and logging back in again?
Hi, I'll just switch to my phone. Okay, so I was going to end with talking about higher education, models of democratic education like Mondragon and Marlborough College. Some schools like the New School had intentions of being a cooperative at the beginning, but that didn't end up that way. The most democratic schools in the world at the moment are in Israel and Palestine. There's about 30 something in one area. I wouldn't say there aren't many democratic schools around the world. I would say it's probably around the number of like 300 or 400 at this time. And I wanted. Okay, the recording. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was how to apply this to our cooperatives and to our co-op of cooperatives. This model of education, which could be more individualized, more learner-led, more democratic. More like I do think that there is a need for more democratic learning institutions for both for learning in general and for cooperative development. And and other things that the democratic education model proposes is a different relationship with the teacher to the student, and having more descriptive evaluations than grading. I'm hoping that we can get into a discussion here, because I threw out a bunch of things here. And I'm wondering what thoughts came up for people in these ideas and how they see it useful in their worlds.
Yeah, I mean, just seems very cool all around. And thinking that a style like this would have prepared me a lot better to be trying to start a worker cooperative or really any kind of business, as someone who, you know, did really well in like the standard type of school and then got out and realized that none of those skills or that knowledge is necessarily relevant to, you know, setting a goal and pursuing a project, but that doing those things does itself lead to a lot of learning. So yeah, these are all very cool to hear about.
I have a question about sort of like the self-directed part of things. Because I think something that I've seen in co-ops has been that there are things that people often are disinterested in, but that are still important to know. And I think especially like finances comes to mind, right? That a lot of people are like, I don't want to know anything about finance. I don't know how to do math. I don't want to learn it. And so I'm curious how with self-directed learning, like, are there ways to inspire people and students to be interested in things that they aren't inherently interested in, so that they learn things that might be important to learn?
I mean, there is a part of cooperative management, which is like making decisions of like, this is what we as a group need to do. And even if no one wants to, I don't know, wash the dishes, someone's got to do it, you know, kind of decisions, you know. So in a democratic workplace setting or an intentional community setting, I think that it definitely can be a discussion as a group that like we may not enjoy learning this or we may not enjoy doing this, but there is a responsibility to the group that we all, you know, have knowledge of how our business finances run, you know. But I think that it shouldn't be all that. I don't think it should be all what our responsibilities to the enterprise are. I do like the idea that individuals are responsible to the group and the group isn't responsible to individuals. You know, like we should be supporting everyone's individual learning, even if it's beyond the scope of the cooperative. It's my opinion.
I wanted to say thank you, Abe. That was a really great presentation. And some of the efforts I am doing here in Chicago with with what we are doing here in Chicago with a few community members in the Latinx space for cooperatives is we're in the works to start a reflection circle. Because especially social with a co-op at center saw the need of spaces just to be able to breathe and reflect and think about these deeper ideas of why we need co-ops and being able to grow the movement that way and in a form that people are not rushing to the need of starting a co-op because they need work and money now, but really being able to reflect like, why do we need co-ops? What is it in the ecosystem or in the business as usual ways that is driving us to build them? And the way we want to do it is on a more, definitely on a more popular education model where community members get to have their curiosities lead the process. So that's been a lot of fun, and it's definitely been pointing me towards popular education for adults and how to grow the co-op movement that way. And right now it feels like this massive task, and we're slowly breaking it down. So I don't even know if a question to think about, but I'm just really grateful for all the examples you presented. But yeah, if anyone is interested in that kind of reflection circles and like co-creating them in other communities, I'd be really happy to talk to them.
Nice.
I would, or is it or okay if we have a kind of like discussion or I guess like responding to and like asking other participants, or just be hoping to facilitate more, Abe?
General response to this presentation, or is that what you're asking?
Well, I was actually just like, I'm curious to ask Renata a question. I didn't know if that was, if that kind of open discussion is appropriate, or if you wanted to keep it to more of like what you covered in the presentation.
Oh, yeah, go for it. That's fine.
Sweet. Well, okay, awesome. And I see your contact info, Renata. I'm curious, and also actually maybe Abe, you can chime in on this front based on the historical models. But I'm curious if you guys are like how you're exploring paying for that, if that would be, if that like popular education would be some kind of a subscription, if it would be a for-profit venture, or incorporated as a cooperative, if that's available in Illinois, or a nonprofit, that kind of thing.
No, so far it's just been volunteer. Volunteer and open it up to the community for free. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Neural in Chicago. Also, I had a question for Abe. Actually, first of all, thanks for the historic perspective. Secondly, it said that like adult education needs to be more interactive, irrespective of how democratic the structure is, and there needs to be give and take, time to reflect. In other words, it seems to me the things that we don't really necessarily give younger students in traditional education the time to do. Does democratic education have anything to say about like the specific needs of adults versus children?
Well, I would say that like democratic education applied to the university setting, it has been a lot different than Sudbury and free schools. I think that universities as institutions generally have more of a certain curriculum to it, and part of the kind of reason people are there in the first place is kind of say, yeah, you know what you need to become a doctor, not like, well, do you feel passionate about, foot surgery? So you need to know foot surgery, so I do think that whether they're in democratic processes, I think there is room for both expertise, like holding the room for expertise and holding the space for stakeholder involvement. Like students are impacted by how things are run in the school, right? You may not be going to students first for what who don't know about surgery, how you do surgery, but you do want to have them involved with how the program is run. That's what I would say about the main difference there.
Thank you.
Yeah. I do think that the idea of like planning cooperative ecosystems to be multi-generational would be a very powerful thing. It may not be something we all have the resources for locally, but like planning for that would be powerful, imagine like young future cooperators going through grade school, high school, and then being worker owners. I think that would be pretty amazing, you know. Any other questions or thoughts? For anyone who does want to start a democratic school for kids, it's actually a very easy business model. It's not the hardest thing to start from a business perspective. We ran the South Bend Co-op on a sliding scale tuition, which was very economically accessible to everyone, but also financially sustainable because we had we had a limit. You know, we had to balance everyone on the top third sliding scale to everyone on the bottom third of the sliding scale.
I guess that brings up a question for me about the historical information you gave us. Have democratic schools traditionally been like privately paid for, or have they been publicly run ever?
Mostly private, but there have been some public experiments in the US. There are some public democratic schools overseas. I'm not sure which ones exist at the moment. But yeah, so most of the ones in the US have been schools within schools rather than schools unto themselves. And yeah, a lot of the surges in democratic education when a lot more schools came about were in opposition to the, you know, the banking model of education or the factory model of education, you know, the compulsory standardized education of public school. Like the modern schools came about right at the time that the U.S. public education system was getting nationalized at the beginning of the 20th century. And a lot of them sprung up in the mid 19th century when a lot of compulsory schools were getting started, and some in opposition to the Prussian military model of education that became the inspiration for the US public school system. Yeah, the public school system in the US had like three kind of incarnations. It was inspired by the Prussian military and started by Calvinists in Massachusetts. Then it was like nationalized by industrialists and behavioralists in the early 20th century. I'm sorry.
Could you speak a little bit about I would love to hear about the effects of this type of schooling on students after they've become adults and graduated. Like, could you talk about the main differences you see from alumni?
Thank you for asking that. I should have started with that. Yeah, so this is the most impactful thing to me, honestly. Like, if you give students like self-direction, then everything else that starts with the self, like self-motivation and self-knowledge, self-confidence, comes from that. You know, that like it's basically they're learning about themselves, and they're learning about themselves in context of community. So they are learning about what their passions are, and they're learning from their passion. So I have been blown away by how self-confident students have been coming out of these schools. The Sudbury schools have recorded a 99% rate of students going on to colleges or equivalents like, military service or trade schools. And so there's a very high acceptance into colleges. There is a lot more one-on-one relationship of the teacher to the students. They're not crowding in a lot of students into one classroom with one teacher. So, and I would say that the self-direction that is required in higher education has already been experienced by these students. There's a big difference from the compulsory standardized education model of high schools in the US to what is expected of students at college. And I think that these students get a head start. And they know how to cooperate and do conflict resolution.
A couple questions are coming to mind. One is maybe a quick one. You mentioned bell hooks. I'm wondering if there was any specific titles that you recommend. And then also on the funding front, you were saying, to start it, it's not a very difficult business model. I'm curious if, the examples you're thinking of are specifically schools for kids, or, if it's also a place where adults can learn, and then how those schools, like the budgeting for buying, like if it's on the school or the students to get the supplies they need for what they want to learn. Like I'm just thinking of a group locally that does mechanical education, and it's kind of thinking like, oh, if that school didn't exist, if someone wanted to learn that kind of thing, how they would, if you just try to have all the supplies for anything anyone could want to learn, or how that works.
Okay, yeah, I guess I was speaking towards the, ages 5 to 18 with the easy business model, like the day school model. That is very straightforward as a business model. The supplies are, so I would say two things. One, they're often much more spent at democratic schools on things like fiber art tools than like curriculum books. And curriculum books in public schools are ridiculously expensive, and so are school buses. So those two things take up most of the material expenses of public schools. I would say that free schools are much more inclined towards being economically accessible. So they might not have the same kind of material supplies as like a Montessori school, which those schools can be quite pricey and are less likely to have a sliding scale. But yeah, I mean, like in the South Mountain Co-op, we had this room that we called the general store, which was looked like a giant library of materials, art supplies, fiber arts, pottery wheel, and kids could just check them out like a library, we were very well stocked with materials, and we had a big computer room. Yeah, and we had a whole gym, which was nice.
Wow.
In terms of the like kind of folk school or freedom school kind of model, that's more like, fundraise and have things and volunteer labor is normally that model. And cooperative universities, that's a whole nother animal.
Sweet. And then the bell hooks recommendation is the only thing, but yeah, that all sounds magical.
Oh yeah. Teaching to transgress is the first one. Is the first one to start with there. That's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any thoughts or questions? Is it till 3:30 or 3:45?
Until 3:45 Eastern. So we have a little bit of time if folks have
Oh, yeah,
more
I'm sorry.
questions or discussion.
Well, I wanted.
Do any of you have any? Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I feel I've been taking out of space, so go right ahead.
I just was going to ask if any of you have education programs in your cooperatives that go beyond member education. And is there anything that in this that you think might be applicable to your cooperatives?
I can answer that from MedWork. Something that came out of the regional rendezvous 2 years ago was interest regionally in doing a worker cooperative course at the trade school level. So focusing on students who are actively learning a trade rather than a college course or a high school course. And we're actually going to be doing a session on that tomorrow morning. But I think this reinforces the interest that we already had in making sure that there's a lot of popular education incorporated into like how the course is structured. And like already we've talked about, making sure that there is guest speakers, making sure that there's access to visiting cooperatives, that it's not just one person lecturing the whole time about what a cooperative is and how to start one.
Nice. Yeah, I had really great conversations with Frank T. Adams in the earlier 2000s. He wanted to start a labor college that would be student and staff run to help start cooperatives and have different fields of study as well. I really had wished that vision had come into fruition. That I really liked what he had imagined there. And I will say I am entering into some research work over the next 3 years into cooperative universities. So, and I'm not gonna talk specifically about what college it is, but there are still colleges talking about this. There is one college whose teachers union is right now talking about switching their college over to become a cooperative. They're not particularly keen on their president at the moment, and they kind of want to take over basically.
Well, I can talk a little bit about a different project I'm involved with, and I am not with a particular worker co-op yet. I am a graphic designer and have been trying to rope in other designers into starting a co-op with me, but have not yet been successful. But there's a center in Mexico called the Global Justice Center that wants to start some online courses, and we really like the work of Jose Andres Fuentes. He's a postdoctor studying civilizatory crisis and alternatives from the perspective of First Nations in South America. So how to bring First Nations knowledge and teachings and ways of knowing and into our ways of being in order to stop destroying the planet. So we're working together on developing an online course that people can organize into small groups in order to ask some profound questions about the way we live in and how we can collaborate to do things better. So it's all in a very experimental stage, and but definitely we're trying to look at ways into empowering people through use their experiences and their senses to trust themselves and then seek out the information they want. And then integrating like the motivation of how co-ops can be really good solutions.
This is Bob and Betsy's organization, one that they're part of. And
I got hooked into it because of Cliff.
Okay.
I don't think I've met a Bob. I don't think I've met Betsy, but yeah, they're out on San Miguel Allende. Yeah.
Okay. That's very cool. Yeah, that's one thing I was lacking in my presentation is the colonial aspect of education. Schooling is most definitely a colonial act. You know, we know what's happened with boarding schools in the U.S. and Canada, and definitely schooling has been used to erase indigenous knowledge. And yeah, there's definitely decolonization that needs to happen with curriculum, but also just how we structure education, you know. Any other thoughts on people's minds? Okay. That's all I've got. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Eve, could you speak a little bit too about the governance of your co-op? I'm curious if it's parents or if it's.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you for bringing up role of parents. So the Sudbury School culture, you know, the first school that I was part of, is very much about keeping parents away from their kids, like in protection of the kids, like because parents often in even like in learner-led institutions where parents are not used to that model, often they will be like, well, why don't you take some math classes or something like that, you know, and may not always be supportive of the learner-led model. So Sudbury School are pretty protective of the students by keeping parents out. School that I was co-founded with others kind of mixed the free school and Sudbury models together because we had me from a Sudbury school, another founder from Brooklyn Free School, and two mothers who were unschooling moms, which is like learner-led homeschooling. So there was a mix of cultures for our school, and we made decisions by consensus, and that was by staff and students. Now, if we had parent volunteers, and we did, they would be part of that process. But being a parent who did not put in work, like who did not volunteer, didn't have they didn't have direct decision making. That's how we did it. I would say that I have actually been sometimes even happier with the models in intention communities, in the fact that the students are surrounded by these democratic ecosystems in their own lives. I would say that my least favorite part of running a democratic school was the parents. Parents are understandably very protective of their kids, and they drop off their kids and they pick them up. So there isn't always a lot of opportunity to build community and to build trust. So if you have opportunity to build relationships with the adults as much as with the kids, you have a better system than the drop off pickup model of school.
I have another parent question.
Yeah.
Because obviously this is a very different model than what a lot of parents are used to, and probably what a lot of parents experienced themselves. What are some of the things that lead parents to be interested in these schools for their children?
Well, thanks, Kristen. Yeah. The South Mountain Co-op had 3 different groups of parents. We had 1/3 was parents who were homeschooling, mostly unschooling, that just wanted the help with their older kids. Like they had been homeschooling for 13 years and really could use the community backup, or needed to start working after so many years of not making an income for the family. So that was 1/3. Another third was students who were discriminated against in public schools. We had a lot of Black students who were highly discriminated against in the local public school by students and teachers. And really, there are some stories that really would make you cry. They were really horrible. Columbia High School in Maplewood, there was a documentary about the racial discrimination and segregation in those schools, and that was in our town. And also sexual orientation discrimination. We had a lot of LGBTQ kids that were bullied in school, who found our school to be a safe space for them. Yeah, there were a lot of yeah. We had a very highly queer student body. And then the last third would be the overachiever students, the students who were getting straight A's and were miserable. We had some students that, like, we had these 2 students, they would compete over how many numbers of pi they have memorized. And they'd get over 100 digits. Like, these were like, oh my God, they were brilliant kids. There's one student who like created a whole opera, and like that third, they just basically had absolutely no problem with succeeding academically. They just had a hard time with succeeding emotionally. They just were burning themselves out and not learning about themselves. So those parents brought their kids there because they knew this model to be something where that included self-exploration. And in terms of like families that come to it, it is not all left-leaning. which I think I had in my head when I first learned about these schools. It's right across the board. And Sudbury schools might be even more right-leaning. The very common situation with parents was most every parent was an entrepreneur. That was something we noticed. Yeah, I would do the whole thing again. I really loved that experience. I mean, I would do it with it would have to be the right team to do it again. But like, yeah, my kids are all grown. You know, I have an adult child and I have two older teenagers. And I was, you know, before I started the Democratic preschool in Maplewood, I was a stay-at-home dad. You know, I would be involved with the Greenwood Sudbury School, then I unschooled them. Yeah, I'm a premature empty nester after my divorce, and yeah, I would do the whole thing again. I really love the experience. I don't see the time. Where are we on time?
We have about 1 minute left, so if there's any
Okay.
other questions or thoughts, now is the time. Hearing no other questions or thoughts, thank you, Abe, for a really fascinating presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for putting up with my technical difficulties there. And yeah, thank you for letting me talk about this. This is one topic I really love talking about.
I'll second the thanks so much.
Guys, in the other workshop.
See you all later.
And the Zoom will stay open during the break, so you're welcome to stay and talk with other people, but we're gonna turn off recording and interpretation.